The Harris family had dreamed of a fresh start in the suburbs, a place where their daughter Zara could grow up safe and happy. But as they settled into their new home on Hollowbrook Street, a sinister presence began to make itself known. Night after night, young Zara woke screaming, insisting a man was watching her from the shadows. Her parents, Malcolm and Rachel, struggled to believe her, torn between trust in their child and the rationality of adulthood. Little did they know, one fateful night would prove Zara had been telling the truth all along, revealing a horror more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. What unthinkable acts had been taking place in their innocent daughter's room, and how would this shocking discovery change the Harris family forever? Let's find out. But before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. A small moving truck pulled up in front of 1423 Hollowbrook Street, coming to a stop outside the two-story house in Stonefield's quiet suburbs. Malcolm Harris, a 39-year-old marketing manager with a trim build and kind eyes, stepped out of the family car, stretching his arms above his head. His wife, Rachel, 37, emerged from the passenger side, her teacher's instinct already kicking in as she scanned the neighborhood for potential hazards. "Come on, Zara," Rachel called, opening the back door. "We're here." Their 8-year-old daughter, Zara, bounced out of the car, her braids swinging as she twirled to take in their new surroundings. Her eyes widened with excitement, darting from house to house, imagining all the adventures that awaited her. As Malcolm began unloading boxes, a portly man in his 60s approached, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Welcome to Hollowbrook Street," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Roger, your landlord." Malcolm shook his hand firmly. "Malcolm Harris, this is my wife Rachel and our daughter Zara." Roger nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Glad to have you folks here. It's a quiet neighborhood, perfect for families." He paused, his expression softening. "I should mention, the previous tenant, Mr. Thompson, passed away in the house a few months back. Natural causes, nothing to worry about. He was well into his 80s. Malcolm and Rachel exchanged a quick glance, but before they could respond, Zara piped up. "Was he a ghost?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Roger chuckled. No ghosts here, little one. Just good memories of a kind old man." As Roger bid them farewell and lumbered back to his car, the family resumed unpacking. Malcolm couldn't shake a slight unease at the news of the previous tenant's passing, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. Hours passed as they carried boxes and furniture into their new home. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky when Malcolm noticed movement from the corner of his eye. A middle-aged white man stood in the neighboring yard, his arms crossed as he glared at the Harris family. Malcolm straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. He considered waving, but something in the man's demeanor made him hesitate. Instead, he turned back to the moving truck, pretending not to notice the neighbor's unwavering stare. As twilight settled over Hollowbrook Street, the neighbor finally approached. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, his lips curled into what might have been a smile but looked more like a sneer. "Evening," the man said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Harold Baker. I live next door." Malcolm nodded, extending his hand. "Malcolm Harris. Nice to meet you, Mr. Baker." Harold ignored the outstretched hand, his eyes roving over Malcolm, then Rachel and Zara, who had come to stand beside her father. "So, you're the new people here, huh?" He chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "I guess things are really going downhill now." Malcolm felt his shoulders tense, but he kept his voice level. "Excuse me?" Harold's smirk widened. "The man who lived here before, he was one of us, good man, respected in the community." His gaze hardened. "Now, well, I guess his legacy is about to get tainted. This neighborhood doesn't need trouble." Rachel stepped forward, her arm protectively around Zara's shoulders. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Baker, but we're here to be part of this community, not cause trouble." Harold scoffed. "This place isn't for people like you. I mean, the old man, he'd roll in his grave if he knew. But I guess that's how it goes. They move in and everything falls apart. Malcolm felt a surge of anger, but he tamped it down, acutely aware of Zara's wide-eyed stare. "Mr. Baker, I think it's best if you leave now. We've had a long day and we'd like to finish settling in." Harold's eyes narrowed, but then, unexpectedly, he turned to Zara and smiled. It was a small gesture, barely there, but it sent a chill down Malcolm's spine. There was something unsettling about that smile, a hint of malice that Malcolm couldn't quite place. As Harold turned to leave, he called over his shoulder, "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." The family watched in silence as Harold disappeared into his house. Once he was gone, Malcolm knelt down to Zara's level. "Hey, sweetheart, why don't you go inside and start unpacking your room? Mom and I will be right there to help." Zara nodded, her usual exuberance dampened by the tense encounter. As she trudged inside, Malcolm turned to Rachel, his expression grim. "We didn't move here to make friends," Rachel said softly, squeezing Malcolm's hand. "We're here for Zara, for her future. We can handle this." Malcolm nodded, forcing a smile. "You're right, it's just one difficult neighbor. We've faced worse." As they headed inside to join their daughter, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. They had chosen this neighborhood for its reputation as a safe, family-friendly community. But beneath the well-manicured lawns and picket fences, he sensed an undercurrent of tension that threatened to pull them under. The first night in their new home passed quietly, the Harris family exhausted from the move. Malcolm and Rachel fell into a deep sleep, lulled by the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of their new house. But their peace was short-lived. In the early hours of the morning, a piercing scream shattered the silence. Malcolm bolted upright, his heart pounding. Beside him, Rachel was already scrambling out of bed. "Zara!" she gasped, and they both raced down the hallway to their daughter's room. Malcolm burst through the door first, flicking on the light. Zara sat bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her face. Rachel rushed to her side, gathering the trembling child in her arms. "Baby, what's wrong?" Rachel asked, stroking Zara's hair. "Did you have a bad dream?" Zara shook her head vigorously, her voice quavering as she spoke. "There was a man in my room, Mommy. He was standing right there." She pointed a shaking finger towards the foot of her bed. Malcolm immediately scanned the room, checking behind the door, in the closet, under the bed. He even went to the window, ensuring it was locked. But there was no sign of an intruder, no evidence that anyone had been in the room besides Zara. "There's no one here, sweetie," Malcolm said gently, returning to sit on the edge of the bed. "It must have been a bad dream." Zara shook her head again, more insistently this time. "No, Daddy, he was real. He was standing right there, watching me. I saw him." Malcolm and Rachel exchanged worried glances. Rachel hugged Zara tighter, rocking her gently. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now. Mommy and Daddy are here." As Zara's sobs began to subside, Malcolm's mind raced. Could someone have actually been in the room? But how? The windows were locked. The house was secure. Then a thought struck him. "Zara, honey," he said softly, "do you remember earlier today when the landlord told us about the old man who used to live here?" Zara nodded, hiccuping slightly. "Well, sometimes when we hear stories like that, especially in a new place, our imagination can play tricks on us. Maybe that's what happened tonight. Your mind created an image of the old man because you were thinking about the story." Zara seemed to consider this, her brow furrowing in thought. "Maybe," she said uncertainly, "but he looked so real, Daddy." Rachel shot Malcolm a grateful look. "Your dad's right, sweetie. Moving to a new place can be scary, and sometimes our minds create things that aren't really there. But you're safe here with us, okay?" Zara nodded again, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Can you stay with me until I fall asleep?" "Of course," Rachel said, settling in beside her daughter. She looked up at Malcolm. "You should go back to bed. You have work in the morning." Malcolm hesitated, torn between his desire to comfort his daughter and the nagging worry in the back of his mind. Finally, he nodded, leaning down to kiss Zara's forehead. "Good night, Princess. Sweet dreams." As he walked back to their bedroom, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had taken root in his chest. He tried to rationalize it away. Of course, Zara would be unsettled in a new environment. The story about the previous tenant, combined with the stress of the move and that unsettling encounter with their neighbor, it was no wonder she had a nightmare. But as he lay in bed staring at the unfamiliar shadows on the ceiling, Malcolm found himself questioning their decision to move here. They had chosen this neighborhood for its promise of a better future for Zara, but now he wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. Sleep eluded him for the rest of the night, his mind replaying Zara's terrified scream and the look of malice in their neighbor's eyes. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, Malcolm made a silent promise to himself and his family. They would make this work. They had to. There was too much at stake to let one difficult neighbor or one bad night derail their dreams. But even as he tried to convince himself, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. What if this was just the beginning? What if there were more challenges, more hostility waiting for them in this seemingly idyllic neighborhood? Malcolm pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. They would take it one step at a time, one day at a time. That was all they could do. The next 2 days passed in a blur of unpacking boxes, arranging furniture and trying to establish a sense of normalcy in their new home. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Each night Zara woke up screaming, insisting that the man had returned to her room. On the third night, Malcolm and Rachel sat at the kitchen table, mugs of cooling coffee between them. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, a constant reminder of another sleepless night ahead. "We have to do something," Malcolm said, his voice low and strained. "This can't go on. She's terrified, Rachel." Rachel sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. I know, but what can we do? We've checked the room 100 times. There's no one there, Malcolm." "Maybe we should install cameras," Malcolm suggested, "or call the police, just to be safe." Rachel's eyes widened. "The police, Malcolm, we can't. Do you know how that would look? A black family, new to the neighborhood, calling the police because their daughter had a nightmare?" Malcolm's jaw clenched. "This isn't just a nightmare, Rachel. She describes him the same way every time, an older white man, standing at the foot of her bed watching her. What if it's real? What if someone is actually getting into our daughter's room?" Rachel reached across the table, taking Malcolm's hand. "Listen to yourself, honey. How could someone be getting in? The windows are locked. We have an alarm system. It's not possible." "But what if it is?" Malcolm insisted, his voice rising slightly. "What if there's even a small chance that it's true? What horrible things could this man be doing in our daughter's room?" Rachel flinched at the implication. Don't even think like that. Zara is fine, Malcolm. Shaken up, yes, but physically fine. This has to be a phase, brought on by the stress of moving. New house, new school, new everything. It's a lot for an 8-year-old to process." Malcolm pulled his hand away, standing up to pace the kitchen. "So we just do nothing, wait it out and hope it passes?" "That's not what I'm saying," Rachel replied, her tone measured. "We support her, we reassure her, we make her feel safe. But we don't jump to wild conclusions or make a scene that could jeopardize our place in this community before we've even settled in." Malcolm stopped pacing, leaning against the counter. He was about to respond when a small voice from the doorway made them both turn. "Mommy, Daddy?" Zara stood there in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "I can't sleep." Rachel immediately went to her, kneeling down to her level. "What's wrong, baby? Another bad dream?" Zara shook her head. "No, I'm scared to go to sleep. I don't want the man to come back." Malcolm felt his heart break at the fear in his daughter's voice. He joined Rachel, placing a comforting hand on Zara's shoulder. "Sweetheart, remember what we talked about how sometimes our imagination can play tricks on us?" Zara nodded hesitantly. "Well," Malcolm continued, choosing his words carefully, "do you think maybe that's what's happening here? That maybe you're not really seeing a man, but just imagining it because you're in a new place and feeling a little scared. Zara's brow furrowed in thought. For a moment she looked like she might argue, but then her expression changed. Maybe, she said slowly. Maybe you're right, Daddy. I'm not totally sure anymore. Malcolm and Rachel exchanged a look of surprise and relief. That's okay, sweetheart, Rachel said soothingly. It's normal to feel unsure sometimes, especially in a new place. The important thing is that you're safe here with us. Zara nodded, some of the tension leaving her small frame. Can I sleep with you tonight? Rachel hesitated, looking to Malcolm. They had been trying to encourage Zara's independence, but given the circumstances... Of course you can, Malcolm said, scooping Zara up in his arms. Just for tonight, okay? As they settled into bed, Zara nestled between them. Malcolm couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. Had Zara really just been imagining things all along? Or had she sensed their worry and decided to say what she thought they wanted to hear? He glanced at Rachel over Zara's head, seeing his own conflicted emotions mirrored in her eyes. They had moved here for a better life, for more opportunities for Zara. But now, lying in the dark with his frightened daughter between them, Malcolm wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. The night passed slowly, each creak of the settling house making Malcolm tense. He found himself straining to hear any unusual sounds, any indication that there might be an intruder. But the house remained quiet, and eventually Zara's breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the curtains, Malcolm made a decision. He would install cameras discreetly. Not because he truly believed someone was breaking in. The rational part of his mind still insisted that was impossible, but because he needed to know for certain. He needed proof, one way or the other, to put this fear to rest. He looked at Rachel, who had finally drifted off, her arm protectively draped over Zara. They had come here for a fresh start, for a chance at the American dream. He wouldn't let fear or doubt or the prejudice of one bitter neighbor destroy that dream before it had even begun. But as he lay there, watching the sun slowly illuminate the unfamiliar corners of their new bedroom, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that they were balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one misplaced step, and everything they had worked for could come crashing down around them. With that unsettling thought, Malcolm closed his eyes, hoping to catch a few moments of rest before facing another day in their new, increasingly uncertain reality. The following evening, after tucking Zara into bed with extra hugs and reassurances, Malcolm found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The gentle whir of the ceiling fan and Rachel's soft breathing beside him did little to calm his racing thoughts. He had spent the day researching security cameras, torn between his desire to protect his family and the nagging fear that he was overreacting. The logical part of his mind insisted that Zara's fears were just a product of an overactive imagination, spurred by the stress of moving and that unsettling encounter with their neighbor. But another part of him, the part that had learned through hard experience to trust his instincts, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the digital clock on the nightstand ticked over to midnight, Malcolm sighed and carefully slid out of bed, trying not to wake Rachel. He padded quietly down the hallway, pausing outside Zara's room. Pressing his ear to the door, he listened intently, half expecting to hear the sound of his daughter's frightened whimpers. Instead, there was only silence. Malcolm was about to return to bed when a faint sound caught his attention. It was barely audible, a whisper of movement from within Zara's room. His heart began to race, pounding so loudly in his ears that he was sure it would wake the entire house. With trembling fingers, he grasped the doorknob, turning it slowly to avoid making any noise. In one swift motion, he pushed the door open, flicking on the light switch as he entered. "Zara?" he called out, his voice tight with fear. The room was exactly as they had left it hours before. Zara's favorite stuffed animals were arranged neatly at the foot of her bed. Her bookshelf stood undisturbed, and the window was firmly shut and locked. And there, in the center of it all, was Zara, sound asleep in her bed, her chest rising and falling with deep, peaceful breaths. Malcolm let out a shaky sigh of relief, running a hand over his face. He moved quietly to Zara's bedside, gently brushing a stray curl from her forehead. She stirred slightly at his touch, but didn't wake. For several long moments, Malcolm stood there watching his daughter sleep. In the soft glow of her nightlight, she looked so small, so vulnerable. The weight of his responsibility as a father pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A shadow, oddly shaped, fell across Zara's dresser. Malcolm froze, his gaze darting to the window, half expecting to see a figure silhouetted against the moonlight. But there was nothing there, just the branches of the old oak tree in the backyard, swaying gently in the night breeze. Malcolm shook his head, chuckling softly at his own paranoia. He was letting his imagination run wild, seeing threats in every shadow. This had to stop. For his own sake, and for the sake of his family, he needed to get a grip on reality. Closing Zara's door softly behind him, Malcolm made his way back to the master bedroom. Rachel stirred as he slipped under the covers. "Everything okay?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," Malcolm whispered back, wrapping an arm around her. "Everything's fine. Go back to sleep." As Rachel's breathing evened out again, Malcolm lay awake, his mind churning. He had been so sure he'd heard something in Zara's room, but there had been nothing there. No sign of disturbance, no mysterious intruder, just his own daughter sleeping peacefully. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe this was all just a product of stress and an overactive imagination, not just Zara's, but his own as well. They had uprooted their entire lives for this move, taken a huge risk in the hope of providing a better future for their daughter. It was natural to feel some anxiety, to be hyper-vigilant in a new environment. And yet, the memory of Harold Baker's cold eyes and malicious smile floated unbidden into Malcolm's mind. The neighbor's thinly veiled hostility, his ominous warnings about the neighborhood going downhill. It all left a knot in Malcolm's stomach that he couldn't quite ignore. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside their window, Malcolm made a decision. He would install the security cameras, but discreetly. Not because he truly believed someone was breaking into their home, but because he needed to put this fear to rest once and for all. He needed concrete evidence to either confirm his suspicions or prove them unfounded. With that resolution, Malcolm finally drifted into a fitful sleep, his dreams filled with shadowy figures and the sound of his daughter's frightened cries. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tension that had settled over the Harris household. Malcolm dragged himself out of bed, bleary-eyed from his restless night. He had just finished brewing a pot of much-needed coffee when Zara's voice rang out from upstairs. Dad, come quick!" The urgency in her tone sent a jolt of adrenaline through Malcolm's system. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding. "Zara, what's wrong?" He found her standing in the doorway of her room, still in her pajamas, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Dad," she said, her voice quavering slightly. "The man was here again. He left something." Malcolm felt his stomach drop. He knelt down to Zara's level, placing his hands on her shoulders. "What do you mean, sweetie? What did he leave?" Instead of answering, Zara took his hand and led him into her room. Malcolm's eyes darted around, taking in every detail, looking for any sign of disturbance. Everything seemed to be in its place. The bed was still made, the stuffed animals arranged neatly, the window locked tight. Then Zara pointed to the floor near her closet. "There," she said, "he left that." Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. There, on the soft beige carpet, sat a single brown leather shoe. It was well worn, the kind of sturdy, practical footwear favored by older men, and it most certainly did not belong to anyone in their family. For a long moment, Malcolm simply stared at the shoe, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake or a prank or... "Malcolm, what's going on?" Rachel's voice came from the hallway, tinged with concern. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Rachel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "call the police." Rachel's eyes widened as she took in the scene. Malcolm kneeling on the floor, Zara clutching his arm, and the mysterious shoe sitting innocuously on the carpet. Without a word, she nodded and hurried downstairs to make the call. Malcolm turned back to Zara, trying to keep his voice calm despite the fear coursing through him. "Sweetie, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Did you see the man this time?" Zara shook her head, her lower lip trembling slightly. "No, Daddy, I woke up and it was just there. But I know it was him, the man who's been watching me." Malcolm pulled her into a tight hug, his mind racing. How could this be possible? They had an alarm system, locked windows, and he'd been awake for half the night. How could someone have gotten in and out without any of them noticing? The next hour passed in a blur. Police officers arrived, their presence drawing curious glances from neighbors who had begun to emerge for their morning routines. Malcolm watched as they bagged the shoe as evidence, asked questions, and took notes. He answered as best he could, trying to convey the fear and uncertainty that had plagued their family since moving in, while also attempting to appear calm and rational. As one officer examined Zara's window, his partner turned to Malcolm with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Harris, I couldn't help but notice. Your daughter's window faces directly towards your neighbor's house. Did you happen to see or hear anything unusual from that direction last night?" Malcolm felt a chill run down his spine as the pieces suddenly clicked into place. The neighbor's house, Harold Baker's hostile welcome, his ominous warnings, that unsettling smile he'd given Zara. Could it be possible? "Officer," Malcolm said, his voice low and urgent, "I think I might know who's responsible for this. Our neighbor, Harold Baker. He's been less than welcoming since we moved in. Made some comments that made us uncomfortable." The officer's eyebrows raised slightly. "Is that so? Well, Mr. Harris, given this new evidence, I think we'd better have a chat with Mr. Baker. Would you be willing to accompany us?" Malcolm nodded, a mixture of determination and apprehension coursing through him. As they prepared to leave, he caught Rachel's eye. She gave him a small, tight nod, silently communicating her support and her own fear. As they stepped out onto the front porch, Malcolm couldn't help but feel that they were crossing a threshold, not just physically but metaphorically as well. Whatever happened next would irrevocably change their lives and their place in this community. With a deep breath, he followed the officers towards Harold Baker's house, each step bringing them closer to confronting the darkness that had been lurking just beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic new life. As they approached Baker's meticulously maintained front yard, Malcolm couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the pristine exterior and the ugliness he suspected lurked within. The flawlessly mowed lawn, the carefully pruned rose bushes, it all seemed like a facade, a mask hiding something sinister. Officer Jenkins, the older of the two policemen, took the lead as they reached the front door. He knocked firmly, the sound reverberating in the quiet morning air. For a moment, there was no response, and Malcolm felt a mix of relief and frustration. But then, the sound of footsteps approached from inside. The door swung open, revealing Harold Baker. He was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, as if he'd been expecting company. His eyes narrowed as they swept over the officers, then widened slightly in mock surprise when they landed on Malcolm. "Well, well," Baker drawled, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" Officer Jenkins stepped forward, his demeanor professional but stern. "Mr. Baker, I'm Officer Jenkins and this is Officer Rodriguez. We're here to ask you a few questions about some disturbances reported by your neighbors, the Harris family." Baker's eyebrows shot up in feigned innocence. "Disturbances? I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I've been nothing but welcoming to our new neighbors." The pause before the last word was slight but noticeable, and Malcolm felt his fists clench at his sides. Officer Rodriguez spoke up, her voice calm but authoritative. "Mr. Baker, we have reason to believe that someone has been entering the Harris home without permission, specifically into their daughter's room. Would you happen to know anything about that?" Baker's face remained impassive, but Malcolm noticed a slight twitch in his left eye. That's a serious accusation, officer. I'm just a peaceful resident here, minding my own business. I certainly haven't seen anyone suspicious hanging around. Malcolm couldn't contain himself any longer. What about you, Baker? Have you been hanging around our house, terrorizing our daughter? Baker's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly composed himself. I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Harris, but I suggest you be very careful about throwing around baseless accusations. Officer Jenkins held up a hand, silencing both men. Mr. Baker, we have evidence that suggests someone has indeed been in the Harris home. A shoe was left behind in their daughter's room. As Officer Jenkins spoke, Officer Rodriguez produced a photo of the brown leather shoe they had found in Zara's room. Baker's reaction was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible intake of breath, but it was enough for Malcolm to notice. Does this shoe look familiar to you, Mr. Baker? Officer Rodriguez asked, her tone neutral but her gaze piercing. Baker shook his head, perhaps a bit too quickly. I've never seen that shoe before in my life, and I resent the implication that I would have anything to do with this alleged break-in. Malcolm opened his mouth to argue, but Officer Jenkins shot him a warning look. The officer turned back to Baker, his voice level but firm. Mr. Baker, given the seriousness of these allegations and the evidence we've uncovered, we're going to need to take a look around your property. Do you consent to a search, or will we need to obtain a warrant? Baker's face flushed red, his composure finally cracking. This is outrageous. You can't just come here and accuse me of what? Breaking into a child's room? I'm a respected member of this community. Mr. Baker, Officer Rodriguez interjected, we're not accusing you of anything at this point. We're simply following up on evidence in an ongoing investigation. Now, will you consent to a search of your property? For a long moment, Baker stood silent, his gaze darting between the officers and Malcolm. Finally, he stepped back from the doorway, his movements stiff with barely suppressed anger. Fine. Search away. You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. As the officers entered the house, Malcolm hung back, his heart pounding. He watched as Baker retreated to his living room, sinking into an armchair with a huff. The man's bravado seemed to have deflated somewhat, replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in the constant tapping of his foot against the hardwood floor. Officer Jenkins began methodically searching the ground floor, while Officer Rodriguez headed upstairs. Malcolm remained near the front door, his eyes never leaving Baker. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence broken only by the sound of drawers opening and closing, of footsteps creaking on the floor above. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Malcolm's mind raced with possibilities. What if they didn't find anything? What if this was all some horrible misunderstanding? Or worse, what if Baker had managed to hide or dispose of any evidence? Just as the doubt began to overwhelm him, Officer Rodriguez's voice rang out from upstairs. Jenkins, you need to see this. Baker's head snapped up, his face draining of color. Malcolm felt a surge of vindication mixed with horror. Whatever the officers had found, it was clear that Harold Baker was not the innocent, respectable neighbor he claimed to be. As Officer Jenkins hurried upstairs, Malcolm braced himself for what was to come. He knew that whatever happened next would change everything, not just for his family, but for the entire neighborhood. The facade of peaceful suburban life had been shattered, revealing the darkness that had been lurking just beneath the surface all along. The tension in Harold Baker's living room was suffocating. Malcolm stood rigid by the front door, his gaze fixed on Baker, who seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes. The once proud man now sat slumped in his armchair, his earlier bravado replaced by a pallor that spoke volumes. Footsteps thundered down the stairs as Officers Jenkins and Rodriguez returned, their faces grim. In Officer Rodriguez's gloved hand was a brown leather shoe, the exact match to the one found in Zara's room. Malcolm felt a wave of nausea wash over him. It was true. All of it. The nightmarish scenario he'd been trying to convince himself was just paranoia had been reality all along. Officer Jenkins stepped forward, his voice tight with barely contained anger. Mr. Baker, would you care to explain this? Baker's eyes darted between the shoe, the officers, and Malcolm. For a moment he seemed on the verge of another denial, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. I don't know what came over me," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm surged forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "What came over you? You terrorized my daughter. You invaded our home. Why? Because we're black? Because you couldn't stand the idea of us living in your neighborhood?" Officer Rodriguez placed a restraining hand on Malcolm's shoulder, but her eyes were fixed on Baker. "Mr. Baker, I need you to stand up slowly and place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for breaking and entering, and given the circumstances, we'll be looking into additional charges." As Officer Jenkins began to read Baker his rights, the man seemed to crumple in on himself. "You don't understand," he mumbled, his eyes downcast. "This neighborhood, it's all I have left. When I saw them moving in, I couldn't let it happen. I thought if I scared them enough, they'd leave." Malcolm felt a surge of rage so powerful it left him breathless. "You thought terrorizing a child was the answer? Do you have any idea what you've put my family through?" Baker flinched at Malcolm's words but said nothing, as Officer Jenkins secured the handcuffs around his wrists. As they led him out of the house, neighbors began to gather on their front lawns, whispering among themselves at the sight of the respected Harold Baker being escorted to a police cruiser in handcuffs. Malcolm followed them out, his mind reeling. As Baker was placed in the back of the police car, their eyes met one last time. In that moment, Malcolm saw not the monster who had terrorized his family, but a sad, broken man consumed by his own fear and hatred. It didn't excuse what Baker had done, not by a long shot, but it made Malcolm realize just how poisonous unchecked prejudice could be. Officer Rodriguez approached Malcolm as her partner finished securing Baker in the vehicle. "Mr. Harris, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. We'll also need to speak with your wife and daughter." Malcolm nodded, his voice hoarse. "Of course, whatever you need." As the police car pulled away, Malcolm turned back towards his house. Rachel stood on their front porch, Zara clutching her hand tightly. The relief on their faces was palpable, but Malcolm knew this was far from over. The arrest was just the beginning. Inside their home, the family gathered in the living room, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to dissipate. Zara, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest, looked up at her parents with wide eyes. "Is Mr. Baker going to jail?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Malcolm and Rachel exchanged a look. They had been so caught up in the whirlwind of events that they hadn't fully explained the situation to Zara. Rachel pulled Zara onto her lap, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "Mr. Baker did something very wrong, and yes, he might go to jail, but that's for the judge to decide. The important thing," Malcolm added, kneeling beside them, "is that you're safe now. He can't hurt us anymore." Zara nodded, but her brow furrowed in thought. But why did he do it? Why did he want to scare us? Malcolm felt a lump form in his throat. How could he explain the complexities of racism and prejudice to an 8-year-old? "Sometimes," he began slowly, "people are afraid of things they don't understand. Mr. Baker was afraid of change, of people who looked different from him, but that doesn't make what he did right." "No, it doesn't," Rachel agreed, "and that's why we have to stand up to people like Mr. Baker. We have to show them that being different isn't something to be afraid of." As Zara snuggled closer to her mother, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. They hadn't asked for this fight, but now that it had found them, they would see it through. Not just for themselves, but for every family that might come after them. The news of Baker's arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood. As Malcolm stepped outside to get some air, he noticed a group of neighbors gathering on the sidewalk. For a moment, his heart raced, old fears rising to the surface. But as he approached, he saw that their faces were open, concerned. Sarah Thompson, a middle-aged woman from 3 houses down, stepped forward. "Malcolm," she said, her voice carrying a note of shame, We wanted to apologize. We should have been more welcoming when you moved in. We should have seen what was happening with Harold." Another neighbor, Tom Chen, nodded in agreement. "We've lived here for years thinking this was such a perfect little community. but we were blind to the ugliness that was right under our noses. We want you to know your family is welcome here, more than welcome. You're part of us now." Malcolm felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, all united in their support. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't erase the trauma his family had endured. But it was a start. "Thank you," he managed to say. That means a lot to us." As the neighbors offered words of encouragement and support, Malcolm felt something he hadn't experienced since moving to Hollowbrook Street, a sense of belonging. The community that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming was now rallying around them, acknowledging past mistakes and pledging to do better. Returning to the house, Malcolm found Rachel in the kitchen, preparing a much-needed meal for the family. He recounted the interaction with the neighbors and saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes that mirrored his own. "Maybe," Rachel said softly, "this is the beginning of the future we hoped for when we moved here. It's not how we expected it to happen, but—" Malcolm nodded, understanding her unspoken thoughts. They had moved here for a better future, and while the path had been far from smooth, perhaps that future was still within reach. The arrest of Harold Baker had not only put an end to their immediate nightmare, but had also cracked open the facade of the neighborhood, exposing the need for change and growth. As they sat down to dinner that evening, the Harris family found themselves at a turning point. The fear that had dominated their lives was receding, replaced by a cautious optimism. They knew challenges lay ahead: court proceedings, potential backlash, the long process of healing. But for the first time since moving to Hollowbrook Street, they felt like they truly had a place in this community. The trial itself was a tense affair that stretched over several days. The Harris family's testimonies were powerful, with Zara's account of her fear moving many in the courtroom to tears. Malcolm and Rachel described their helplessness and the impact on their sense of safety and belonging. "We moved here for a better life," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Instead, we found ourselves living in fear in our own home. Every night I would lie awake, listening for any sound that might mean someone was in my child's room. No parent should have to live like that. No child should have to live like that." Baker's defense team attempted to paint him as a misguided individual who had made a terrible mistake. They brought in character witnesses, old friends and colleagues who spoke of Baker's years of community service and his reputation as a good neighbor. But their arguments fell flat in the face of the evidence and the emotional impact of the family's words. As the trial progressed, it became a catalyst for broader conversations about race, belonging, and what it truly meant to be a welcoming community. Local leaders organized discussions on promoting inclusivity and addressing systemic biases. The school district began reviewing its curriculum to ensure it included diverse perspectives and histories. However, not everyone embraced these changes. The Harris family received anonymous hate mail filled with racial slurs and threats. Ugly comments surfaced on local online forums, with some residents accusing the family of playing the race card and ruining the neighborhood. One evening, Malcolm found Rachel sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of letters with a look of despair on her face. "Maybe we should have just left when this all started," she said softly. "Maybe we're just making things worse." Malcolm sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "We can't think like that," he said firmly. "Remember why we moved here in the first place. For Zara. For a better future. We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for every family that comes after us." Despite these challenges, the Harris family stood firm, buoyed by the support of many in the community who rallied around them. Malcolm and Rachel, along with other families who had faced discrimination, formed a community action group focused on education, advocacy, and support. The group's first meeting was held in the Harris' living room. As Malcolm looked around at the faces of his neighbors, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, all united in their desire for change, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," he told the group. "We're fighting for the future of this community, for our children, and for everyone who comes after us." The group's efforts began to bear fruit. They worked with local officials to strengthen anti-discrimination laws. They partnered with schools to develop programs promoting diversity and inclusion. They even started a neighborhood watch program, not to keep people out, but to ensure everyone felt safe and welcome. As the trial neared its conclusion, the atmosphere in the community began to shift. What had started as a case against one man had become a catalyst for broader change. Local community leaders organized town hall meetings to discuss ways to promote inclusivity and address systemic biases. The school district began reviewing its curriculum to ensure it included diverse perspectives and histories. Even the local real estate agencies started to examine their practices to ensure they weren't perpetuating housing discrimination, however unintentionally. The verdict, when it came, was decisive. Baker was found guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence was harsh, including several years in prison, along with mandatory counseling and community service upon his release. For the Harris family and their supporters, it felt like a vindication, but they knew it was just the beginning of the changes they hoped to see in their community. In the aftermath of the trial, the community learned of an unexpected development. Harold Baker, now serving his sentence, was faced with the necessity of selling his house. The isolated man he had become over the years had left him without any family members or close friends who could maintain the property in his absence. Baker's lawyer informed the community that they had no choice but to put the house on the market. This news brought a sense of finality to the situation. Baker would most surely never return to the neighborhood. The revelation elicited mixed reactions from the residents of Hollowbrook Street. Some felt relief, knowing they wouldn't have to face the prospect of Baker's return. Others expressed surprise at the extent of Baker's isolation, though it certainly didn't excuse his actions. For the Harris family, the news brought a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense of closure, certainly, but also a lingering tension from all they had endured. "It's strange," Rachel said to Malcolm one evening as they discussed the news. "I thought I'd feel relieved, but knowing he's gone for good, it's like the other shoe has finally dropped." Malcolm nodded, understanding her feelings. "It doesn't undo what he did," he said, "but maybe now we can focus on healing and moving forward without the shadow of his return hanging over us." As Baker's lawyer prepared to put the house on the market, the community came together with a new purpose. They were determined to ensure that whoever moved into Baker's old house would be welcomed with open arms, regardless of their background. On the day the sale was finalized, Malcolm stood outside his house, watching as a sold sign was placed in front of Baker's former home. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not the entire burden, but a significant part of it. Rachel came out to join him, wrapping her arm around his waist. "You know," Malcolm said softly, "this whole experience has taught us something crucial. We should always trust our instincts, especially when it comes to our children." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening. "You're right. We came so close to dismissing Zara's fears. From now on, we'll always listen to her, no matter how unlikely her concerns might seem." As they turned to go back inside, Malcolm took one last look at the street they now called home. It wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges to face. But they had found their place here, not just as residents, but as catalysts for change. The visitor at night was gone, but the lessons they had learned would remain, guiding them towards a future where every voice was heard, every fear was acknowledged, and every family felt truly at home. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of resilience and justice. If you were moved by the Harris family's story as much as we were, I've handpicked another tale that will touch your heart. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it next.